It is 10:22 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo is standing on the bridge of the Akagi, the most powerful aircraft carrier in the world. Around him, the greatest naval strike force ever assembled in the Pacific. 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, the same fleet that 6 months earlier had brought the United States Navy to its knees at Pearl Harbor. His planes are on deck, engines running. In 5 minutes, he will launch the counterstrike that will finish what Pearl Harbor started. A lookout screamed 2 words: "Helldivers!" Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally wounded. The man who attacked Pearl Harbor watched his fleet burn. The question isn't just how America won. The question is, how close did Japan come to winning first? A note before we continue. This is an educational history documentary. The events described in this video are real. The language is specific because the subject demands it. The narration you hear is AI generated. The script, research, and all editorial decisions are human authored. Historical photographs and archival footage come from the U.S. National Archives, the Imperial War Museum, and Wikimedia Commons. All sources are public domain and listed in full in the description below. Please remember to like and subscribe. It truly matters to this old grognard. Now, back to the story. 6 months before Midway, Nagumo's carriers had executed the most devastating surprise attack in naval history. Pearl Harbor killed 2,400 Americans, sank or damaged 19 ships, and destroyed 188 aircraft. Japan had done the impossible. But as we explored in our last episode, the man who designed that attack, Yamamoto himself, spent the night of December 7th not celebrating. He spent it writing a letter, worried. Because the American aircraft carriers had been at sea that morning, they were untouched. Here is the thing that Western audiences rarely appreciate about Midway. Japan didn't lose because of one bad decision by Nagumo. Japan lost because the entire strategic foundation of Operation MI was built on a fiction, that the United States could be frightened or exhausted into negotiating peace. Yamamoto knew this was false. He had lived in America. He had watched American factories. He had played poker with American oil men. And he knew that every month the war continued, the gap between Japanese and American industrial capacity would grow wider. Midway wasn't Japan's last chance to win the war, but it was the last moment when winning was still mathematically imaginable. By spring 1942, the Japanese Empire had expanded to its maximum reach. But Yamamoto had a problem. The American carriers kept surviving. And then, on April 18, 1942, something happened that forced Japan's hand. 16 American bombers took off from an aircraft carrier, something no one thought possible, and bombed Tokyo. No serious damage was done, but the psychological impact inside the Japanese military was catastrophic. The Emperor's city had been bombed. It could not happen again. And that terror, that single raid by 80 American volunteers, is what set in motion the chain of events that would end with 4 Japanese carriers on the bottom of the Pacific. Yamamoto's plan was simple in concept, brutal in ambition. Seize Midway Atoll, force the American carriers to defend it, destroy them. The war in the Pacific would be decided in a single afternoon. What Yamamoto did not know, what he could not know, was that the Americans were reading his mail. Deep below the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, in a cramped basement that smelled of cigarette smoke and nervous sweat, a brilliant and impossibly difficult man was running the most consequential intelligence operation in American history. Commander Joseph Rochefort. He ran Station Hypo, the Pacific Fleet's cryptanalysis unit. He was known for wearing a bathrobe and carpet slippers while working. He was also, by most accounts, the most talented codebreaker the Navy had ever produced. I've read a fair amount about Rochefort, and what strikes me every time is the gap between how history remembers him and how the Navy treated him. This man arguably saved the Pacific War. He correctly identified Midway as the target of Operation MI, a conclusion his superiors in Washington actively disputed. He was right. They were wrong. And after the battle, the Navy bureaucracy spent years denying him the credit he deserved, and eventually had him removed from hypo. It took until 1985, 40 years after the war, for the U.S. Navy to formally award him the Distinguished Service Medal he had earned at Midway. He died in 1976, 9 years too early to see it. Rochefort's team had been working on the Japanese Naval Code, designated JN-25, for months. They had broken enough of it to read fragments, the way you might understand a conversation in a language you half know. They knew a major offensive was coming. They knew the target was designated AF. They didn't know what AF meant. Rochefort had a theory. He believed AF was Midway. His superiors in Washington believed it was the Aleutians, or possibly Hawaii itself. The argument was fierce, and then Rochefort did something extraordinary. He sent a message to Midway's garrison. Report, in an uncoded transmission, that the island's water distillation plant had broken down. A fake emergency, broadcast in the open, for Japanese intelligence to intercept. Days later, a Japanese intercept arrived at Hypo. It reported that AF was experiencing a water shortage. Rochefort had his proof. Admiral Nimitz believed him, and the trap was set. There was one more problem. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought 1 month before Midway, had cost America dearly. The carrier Lexington had been sunk. The Yorktown had taken a bomb hit that naval engineers estimated would require 3 months to repair. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. What followed was one of the most extraordinary engineering feats of the entire Pacific War. 1,400 workers descended on the Yorktown and worked around the clock. They didn't fix her properly. They patched her, just enough to fight. 3 days later, she sailed for Midway. The Japanese had sent a scout plane over Pearl Harbor on May 31st to check on the carriers. The pilot saw 2. He correctly reported 2. But he didn't know the Yorktown was already at sea, 3 days ahead of his report. Japan planned for 2 American carriers at Midway. They got 3. That difference, that single carrier, is what saved the battle for America. Of all the strange details at Midway, this is the one that stops me every time I return to it. Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had personally led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had given the famous radio call, "Tora, Tora, Tora," was lying in the sickbay of the Akagi when the battle began. 3 days before Midway, he had undergone emergency surgery for appendicitis. He was not supposed to fly. He was not supposed to move. But Fuchida had spent 6 months as Japan's greatest war hero, and lying in a bunk while history was made above him was not something he could do. He disobeyed his doctors and made his way to the bridge, and he stood there, on crutches, his abdomen still healing, watching Nagumo manage the most consequential morning of the Pacific War. I want to sit with this for a moment. Fuchida's testimony about Midway has been disputed by historians. He embellished. He got details wrong. Partial and Tully, in their meticulous 2005 work, Shattered Sword, dismantled several of his most dramatic claims. But the image of him on that bridge, broken, post-surgical, watching his fleet die, that part is verified. He was there. And what he witnessed that morning, I think, explains why he spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of it. Some of his attempts at explanation became fiction, but the grief behind them was real. At 7:59 in the morning, one of the most bizarre and nearly decisive moments of the entire battle occurred, and it appears in almost no popular account of Midway. A B-26 Marauder, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays, had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. His plane was damaged, his torpedo dropped without effect. Mays's B-26 did not pull up. It flew directly at the bridge of the Akagi, either out of control or in a final act of defiance, or both. It passed so close to the bridge that the officers on it could see inside the cockpit. It cleared the bridge by feet. Then it crashed into the ocean. Chuichi Nagumo was standing on that bridge. Had that plane hit, the Battle of Midway ends differently. History turns on feet, not miles. By 7:15 in the morning, Nagumo was facing a decision that no admiral in history had been asked to make under such circumstances, in such a compressed time frame, with such imperfect information. His first wave of 108 planes had attacked Midway and done significant damage. But the strike commander had radioed back, "There is need for a second attack." Nagumo thought no American carriers were in the area. He was wrong. Earlier that morning, the cruiser Tone had experienced a delay launching its scout plane, one of 7 search aircraft assigned to scan different quadrants of ocean around the fleet. Due to equipment problems, Tone's scout plane launched 30 minutes late. That 30-minute delay would prove to be one of the most consequential mechanical failures in naval history. Because Tone's plane was assigned to the exact sector of ocean where the American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were positioned. I want to be careful here because it's tempting to say Japan lost Midway because of a 30-minute delay by a single float plane. That's too clean. The deeper truth is that Japanese carrier operations were fundamentally less efficient than American ones. Nagumo was already in trouble before Tone's plane launched late, but the late launch made it impossible for him to know the trouble he was in. That is the difference between a difficult problem and a fatal one. At 7:15, with no word of American carriers, Nagumo ordered his reserve planes, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, to be rearmed with contact-fused bombs for a second strike against Midway. The torpedoes were pulled off. The anti-ship bombs were unsecured. General-purpose bombs were brought up. The hangar decks of 4 carriers were filled with loose ordnance. And then, at 7:28 in the morning, the message arrived that changed everything. Tone's scout plane had found something. "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface units." Nagumo halted the rearming. The changeback order went out. But on the hangar decks, partially armed aircraft were being moved in every direction. In the rush to speed the process, armorers left ordnance stacked on the deck instead of moving it back to the magazines below. The carriers were now floating armories. At 9:18 in the morning, American torpedo bombers began their attacks on the Kido Butai. They were flying the TBD Devastator, an aircraft that was already obsolete. Its maximum speed was 206 miles per hour. Japanese Zeros flew at 331. To drop a torpedo, the Devastator had to fly low, slow, and perfectly straight, directly at its target. What happened next is, to me, one of the most terrible and most important sequences in American military history. These men knew what they were flying into. They had seen what the Zeros did to the first wave, and not one of them turned back. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet went first, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who had told his men before launch, "If there is only one plane left to make the final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." One by one, the 15 aircraft of VT-8 were shot out of the sky. 14 of 15 went down. Ensign George Gay dropped his torpedo at the carrier Soryu. The carrier evaded, and Gay's plane was hit. He ditched in the ocean. He was the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. Not one torpedo from VT-8 hit anything. Then came Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise. Same result, no hits. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, no hits. Of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers that attacked that morning, only 6 made it back to their carriers. Only 3 of those were still flyable. Of the 99 men who flew in those 41 aircraft, only 3 survived the battle. Not one torpedo hit. From the Japanese perspective, the battle was over. Wave after wave of American planes had been destroyed. But here is what the Japanese didn't understand. By chasing the torpedo bombers, the Zeros had been dragged down to low altitude. Every carrier in the Kido Butai had spent the last hour maneuvering violently to avoid torpedoes, so violently that the deck crews couldn't spot planes for launch. Nagumo still needed 45 more minutes before he could launch his counterstrike. The torpedo squadrons hit nothing and changed everything. Their deaths pulled the Zeros down, bought time, and left the carriers unable to launch. They didn't die for nothing. They died for everything that came next. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey was running out of time. He was leading 33 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise toward the estimated position of the Japanese fleet. He arrived at that position at 9:20 in the morning. The ocean was empty. Nagumo had changed course. McCluskey's planes were burning fuel every minute. He continued the search. He turned northwest, a guess, an instinct, and kept going. At 9:55, he spotted something below him. A single destroyer making flank speed to the northeast. This is the detail I keep coming back to. The destroyer was the Arashi. She had been left behind to depth charge the American submarine Nautilus, which had been harassing the fleet. Now she was racing to rejoin the carriers, and doing so at full speed, which meant her wake was long, straight, and perfectly visible from altitude. McCluskey didn't know it was Arashi specifically. He just knew that a lone ship running at that speed, in that direction, was probably heading somewhere important. Nimitz would later say that McCluskey's decision to keep searching, and his instinct about the destroyer, decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. A submarine that couldn't sink anything, a destroyer that was running away from it, and a dive bomber commander who noticed. McCluskey followed Arashi's wake. 10 minutes later, he saw smoke on the horizon. At 10:20 in the morning, Nagumo finally gave the order to launch. Fuchida, watching from the bridge of the Akagi, wrote that in 5 minutes all Japan's planes would be launched. The tide of battle, he wrote, would shift completely in that brief interval of time. It's a powerful image. But historians Partial and Tully have spent years demonstrating that it isn't true. I want to be honest about this. The 5-minute story, the idea that Japan was seconds away from launching when the American bombs arrived, is almost certainly a myth. The planes were still in the hangars. The rearming process had been reversed and reversed again. The reality is more painful for Japan and more honest about America. American intelligence, American planning, and American valor had put Japan in a position where even perfect Japanese performance might not have saved the fleet that morning. The Enterprise's bombers arrived from the south. McCluskey was leading 33 planes. To the north, 17 Dauntlesses from Yorktown were arriving by complete coincidence. Separate squadrons, different carriers, launched at different times, guided by different routes. They converged over the Kido Butai simultaneously, by accident. The Zeros were low, chasing the last torpedo planes. The carriers were still maneuvering. Nobody on the Japanese ships was looking up. Kaga, direct hits, 4 bombs. Fires began immediately. Akagi, 1 bomb, just 1, but it struck the edge of the midship deck elevator and penetrated to the upper hangar, where it detonated among fueled aircraft and loose ordnance piled during the frantic rearming. A single bomb destroyed the flagship of the Kido Butai. Soryu, 3 hits, within minutes burning. 3 carriers, mortally wounded. In under 5 minutes. Fuchida watched from the bridge. Minoru Genda appeared beside him and said only one word. Shimata. We goofed. The Akagi was burning from bow to stern. At 10:46, Nagumo climbed out of a bridge window on a rope. Fuchida was left behind. His broken ankles had slowed him. He managed to slide down a rope, but as he reached the deck, an explosion threw him off his feet. He was strapped to a bamboo stretcher and lowered into a lifeboat. He was the last man off the Akagi's bridge. Meanwhile, the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, was still intact. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi launched everything he had. 2 small strikes found the Yorktown, hit her hard. 3 bombs, 2 torpedo hits. The Yorktown stopped dead in the water. America nearly lost its 3rd carrier. But American damage control was extraordinary. And late in the afternoon, dive bombers found the Hiryu. 4 hits. The last Japanese carrier was burning before sunset. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi refused to leave his ship. He gathered the crew on deck, thanked them, and told them to go. He stayed behind. His last words were reported as an apology to the Emperor. The Hiryu burned through the night and was scuttled at dawn. When the survivors of the Kido Butai were brought back to Japan, they were transferred to a hospital ship at night, under complete secrecy. No mail, no telephone calls, no visits from families. Fuchida, recovering from his broken ankles, described the isolation as being just like an internment camp. The Japanese public was told Japan had won a great victory at Midway. The loss of 4 carriers, 250 aircraft, and 3,000 men, including an irreplaceable generation of trained naval aviators, was hidden completely. I think about those men in that hospital ship a great deal. They had fought, they had watched their ships burn, and when they came home, their own country put them in quarantine, not to protect them, but to protect a lie. Most of them were sent back to the front before they had fully recovered. Most of them never returned. Nagumo's chief of staff found the admiral after the battle contemplating suicide. He talked him out of it. Nagumo never commanded effectively again. He wept when speaking to his sons about Midway in 1944. He died in 1944 on Saipan, by suicide, as American forces overran the island. The same impulse found him 2 years later on a different island in a different ocean. And Mitsuo Fuchida? The man who watched Pearl Harbor burn and Midway burn and survived both? He became a Christian missionary after the war. He toured America. He became, according to his own account, more popular in the United States than in Japan. He died in 1976 in Japan as an American citizen. Here is what Japan never understood about the United States. The 4 Japanese carriers that sank at Midway had taken years to build. Their air groups had taken years to train. The pilots who died at Midway represented a year's graduating class of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. Japan had no pipeline to replace them. American industrial production was already building carriers that would dwarf the Kido Butai. American training pipelines were producing pilots in numbers Japan could not match. This is what Yamamoto knew and said openly, that Japan had maybe 18 months, perhaps 2 years, where it could sustain a naval war in the Pacific. After that, American production would simply overwhelm anything Japan could build. He was not wrong. After Midway, Japan's empire only shrank. 4 Japanese carriers, 3 American dive bomber squadrons, 41 torpedo planes that hit nothing and saved everything, a 30-minute late float plane, a destroyed appendix, a B-26 that missed a bridge by feet, a destroyer running home. The Kaga was found on the floor of the Pacific in 2019. She rests in 17,500 feet of water, remarkably intact. Near her, the wreckage of American dive bombers, men who flew in and never flew out. I've been thinking about what Midway means, not as strategy, not as intelligence, but as a human story. The Japanese who went to Midway were not fools. Nagumo was not a coward. The pilots of the Kido Butai were, by any measure, among the finest in the world. They had spent years becoming what they were, and in those few terrible minutes, they were gone. What America brought to Midway was not just better intelligence or better luck, though it had both. What America brought was men who flew into a sky full of zeros, knowing exactly what would happen to them, and flew anyway. Not one torpedo bomber in the entire battle turned back. Not one. I don't know what to do with that. There is no clean strategic explanation for it. It is something else entirely. Ensign George Gay floated in the Pacific that afternoon, hiding under a seat cushion to avoid Japanese pilots. He watched 3 Japanese carriers burn from the water. He was picked up after nightfall. He was 22 years old. The ocean keeps its secrets. But June 4th, 1942 is not one of them. The greatest fleet in the Pacific died not because Japan was weak. It died because America was something Japan had never accounted for. And that something, finally, is very hard to name. It might be called stubbornness, or faith, or the particular kind of courage that keeps going when the math says stop. Whatever it is still there. Thank you for watching. If this is the kind of history you're looking for, subscribe. There's always another story waiting. The next documentary starts right after this one.